Elagabalus. To be honest, since I started making these videos, I've wanted to cover him, but I already put it off because he seemed too obvious a figure, the sort of historical persona anyone interested in this channel's subject matter probably already knows about. But his story is very interesting, pretty tragic, and goes beyond even what ancient writers said about his sexuality and gender presentation, so why not? Honestly, at the very least, I would say Elagabalus has one of the most unique and personal busts of any Roman emperor. You can so easily, just by looking at this image, envision him as a wide-eyed adolescent with a wispy mustache growing in. Thanks to artist Daniel Vauchart, you can even see what Elagabalus might have looked like in the flesh. He was only 14 years old, younger than when we usually let people drive, when he was put in charge of one of the largest empires in history. There's no doubt he would have been better off if he was never emperor. Elagabalus, whose birth name was actually Sextus Varius Avitus Bassianus, was already born into prestige and luxury. He was descended from the kings of Edessa, today the region of Homs in western Syria. The Edessans were an Arabic people who grew rich, controlling the trade routes between the cities of Syria and the Arabic Peninsula. The kings became clients of the Roman Empire in the 1st century BCE. Sometime around a couple centuries later, they suffered the same fate as most of Rome's client kings and ended up having their territories annexed. But the Romans did allow the former kings of Edessa to continue serving as the hereditary high priest of their god, Elagabal, a Latinization of the god's Arabic name/title, Ila al-Jabal, god of the mountain. Elagabalus was the latest in this long line of priests. It's from this god that he was literally born to serve that Elagabalus takes the name historians remember him by, even though it seems like he never actually used it as a name during his own life. These priests' responsibility included presiding over the Temple of Elagabal, which was one of the most famous temples in the ancient world, although its exact location has unfortunately been lost and it's still debated by archaeologists and historians. Some, like the archaeologist Warwick Ball, think it might be the temple complex at Baalbek, also known as Heliopolis, the ruins of which still exist today in Lebanon. So how did a teenage Syrian high priest of Arabic origin become emperor of Rome? Well, the story starts with Julia Domna, Elagabalus' great aunt. She married an up-and-coming politician from modern-day Libya named Septimius Severus. No one could have known that there would be a civil war over the imperial office that would end with Septimius Severus becoming emperor in the year 193. The first Roman emperor, in fact, born outside of Italy. When Severus died, his and Julia Domna's sons Geta and Caracolla were to rule as co-emperors. Naturally, Caracolla promptly arranged for Geta's death. Emperor Caracolla is usually known for two things: extending citizenship rights to all inhabitants of the Roman Empire, and getting stabbed to death by an assassin at an army camp while answering the call of nature. Julia Domna, who was already ill from breast cancer, committed suicide soon after receiving the news. With Caracolla, the dynasty of Septimius Severus came to an end. The Praetorian prefect, Macrinus, who may or may not have played a role in Caracolla's assassination, declared himself the new emperor. At least, that should have been the end of the Severans. But then Julia Domna's sister, Julia Mesa, and her daughter, Julia Somaeus, stepped up. Sorry, I know that's a lot of Julias. Just remember for the quiz that Julia Somaeus and her husband, the Roman nobleman Sextus Varius Marcellus, were the parents of Elagabalus. Julia Mesa spread the rumor that Elagabalus' true father wasn't actually Sextus Varius Marcellus, but Caracalla, who had slept with his cousin. This might seem like a very odd propaganda campaign, but it was designed to exploit the fact that Caracalla was still popular among the Roman legions. Of course, money usually travels further than just words, so Julia Maesa also bribed some troops to defect to her family's side. More soldiers defected, and the rebellion against Macrinus spread until his forces were defeated, and after fleeing from one disastrous battle, Macrinus himself was killed at Antioch. The Severans were back. Now, I should admit that while Elagabalus is one of Rome's most delightfully notorious emperors, we really don't know much about him. Even by the patchy standards of a lot of ancient history, the sources are a bit lacking. Basically, we only have 3 primary sources about Elagabalus that were written during or close to his lifetime. The anonymously written Historia Augusta, the Histories of Cassius, and Herodian's History of the Empire from the death of Marcus Aurelius. Of these, parts of the chapter of Cassius on Elagabalus have been lost. In the Historia Augusta, it's not unlike using supermarket tabloids as a source on late 20th century world history. As an aside, though, it is worth reading the Historia Augusta on Elagabalus just to see the multiple times the writer or writers of the book say something like, "Concerning his life, many filthy anecdotes have been put into writing, but since they are not worthy of being recorded, I have thought I ought to relate only such deeds as illustrate his extravagance." And then you get page after page of incredibly bizarre and sordid stories. But the point is, arguably even more so than other bad Roman emperors, when it comes to Elagabalus, it's harder to get closer to the real Elagabalus. Although perhaps not impossible. Back to the story. Julia Maesa understandably thought it was important that Elagabalus return to Rome to shore up his popularity with the Roman people in the Senate. To prepare the Romans for the fact that their new emperor was a Syrian priest, Elagabalus changed his name to Marcus Aurelius Antoninus in an attempt to invoke the memories of the beloved emperors Marcus Aurelius and his adopted father Antoninus Pius. Julia Maesa sent a painting to Rome long ahead of Elagabalus while he remained in the Middle East. Warwick Bell thinks this account might actually be true, and a coin depicting Elagabalus dressed in his priestly robes could have been based on this painting. This did not stop many elite Romans from being scandalized once their new emperor set foot in Rome. Here's Herodian's description. The god was set up in a chariot studded with gold and precious stones and driven from the city to the suburb. The chariot was drawn by a team of 6 large, pure white horses, which had been decorated with lots of gold and ornamented discs. No human person ever sat in the chariot or held the reins, which were fastened to the god as though he were driving himself. Antoninus, that is, Elagabalus, ran along in front of the chariot, but facing backwards as he ran, looking at the god and holding the bridles of the horses. He ran the whole way backwards like this, looking up at the front of the god, but to stop him tripping and falling while he was not looking at where he was going, lots of sand gleaming like gold was put down, and his bodyguard supported him on either side to make sure he was safe as he ran like this. Along both sides of the route, the people ran with a great array of torches, showering wreaths and flowers on him. Members of the Roman Senate were also obliged to participate, which no doubt hardly helped his popularity. But Warwick Bell speculates this was probably the standard ritual precision for the god. For example, a stone as a sacred object, representing a god who might otherwise have no representative images, was fairly common among Semitic religions. Think of the black stone that was venerated in the Arabic Peninsula in pre-Islamic times, and is still part of the Kaaba in Mecca today. Such sacred stones are also mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as being encountered in a positive light by the biblical patriarchs, Jacob and Joshua, and were held as sacred objects in parts of Greece and by some Phoenician cities. So to Elagabalus, this was just a way to welcome his god to Rome, so he could continue his usual religious duties, along with working his side gig as the Roman emperor. Herodian's mocking description gives us an idea of what the Romans thought about all this. If you want to try to think about this in modern terms, imagine maybe a president of the United States or the Prime Minister of France doing a Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn ritual on a live broadcast. It wasn't all festivities, though. There's also the executions of several high-profile figures like governors and senators. While unfortunate, this didn't make Elagabalus any worse than even many good emperors, especially ones who came to power after a coup or after defeating a rival in a civil war. Even the sources hostile to him admit that he spared many people who had insulted him or Caracalla. Also, there's a tradition preserved by the 6th century historian John Malalas that Elagabalus ended an unpopular tax that existed since the days of Julius Caesar and publicly burnt the relevant records. But there's a possibility that John Malalas was confusing Elagabalus with his chosen namesake, Antoninus Pius. All the other sources concur that Elagabalus was left to do the same priestly job he had back in Syria, while the actual business of government was mostly managed by the Julias, who did have far more political experience than the 14-year-old. Despite that, our ancient historians allege that Elagabalus gave away and outright sold various honors and political offices to actors, chariot drivers, and other people considered the lowest of the low in Roman society. Worse, he basically tried to do a spiritual coup. He had the other sacred objects kept around Rome confiscated and placed in one location on the Palatine Hill, demanded to see the most holy and guarded sanctuary of the Vestal Virgins, and started practicing the rites of the goddess Sibyl. Although in the exact same passage, the Historia Augusta also alleges that Elagabalus aimed to eventually abolish all religious sects except those of his god. The Historia Augusta also snidely remarks that Elagabalus wanted his god to marry the goddess Minerva, but he found her too butch for his liking. This leads us to the other problem our historians have with Elagabalus and what makes him so fascinating a figure today. Among other things, Elagabalus refused to wear old-fashioned Roman cotton, instead always wearing silk. Also, he'd only appear in public wearing makeup. The sources tend to paint him as a bisexual nymphomaniac, running through a series of wives and having sex with multiple men. His male lovers included men who were said to be well endowed. His favorite was Heracles, a handsome, athletic, and blonde-haired chariot driver who won Elagabalus's heart when he fell and lost his helmet during a race. Cassius claims Elagabalus considered Heracles as a husband, and that Heracles would beat the emperor whenever he cheated on him. Dio, who has the most detailed anecdotes about Elagabalus's marriage to Heracles by far, also claims that there was another man who nearly won Elagabalus's heart, Aurelius Zodicus, the son of a barber. Since Elagabalus was mainly interested in, let's say, Zodicus's intimate attributes, Heracles somehow slipped Zodicus an herbal concoction that kept him from getting an erection. After that, Zodicus was thrown out of the palace. Cassius further reports that Elagabalus wanted to receive an operation that would give him a vagina, which may be the first time a writer anywhere described what we would call a sex change operation. Outside of matters of gender, sex, and faith, Elagabalus had a taste for practical jokes. When the guests at his banquets got blackout drunk, he would put them in a cage with a ferocious-looking but harmless beast. Also, he liked to seat his guests on what the author of Historia Augusta describes as air pillows, and he would let out the air while they were dining. In other words, Elagabalus may have invented the whoopee cushion. Despite his libertine lifestyle and supposed marriage to Heracles, Elagabalus was also a conventionally married man, although details and even the exact timeline are lacking. First, he married Julia Cornelia Paula, yes, another Julia, a noblewoman who was descended from the House of Cornelia, one of the oldest noble families in Rome. Then he reportedly divorced her to marry a Vestal virgin, Aquilia Severa, in a union Romans considered blasphemous. But Elagabalus ended things with this woman too, and married a third time, to Aeneia Aurelia Faustina, who came from the family of Marcus Aurelius. For whatever reason, Elagabalus left her and remarried Aquilia Severa. The sources all hint that Elagabalus's erratic behavior and devotion to a strange foreign god cost him his popularity with the soldiers who once revered him as the son of their hero Caracalla. Julia Mesa pressured Elagabalus into making a momentous decision to try to fix this PR problem. She had another daughter, Julia Mamaea, who had a young son. Elagabalus adopted this son, who eventually took the name Severus Alexander. Soon enough, Elagabalus declared this young man as his heir and gave him the title of Caesar. If Julia Mesa meant for this to be a way to get off the sinking ship, the SS Elagabalus, she couldn't have planned it better. Members of the Roman army began to rally around Severus Alexander, who even as an adolescent showed a quiet, ascetic personality, the exact opposite of Elagabalus. Also around this time, Elagabalus married Aeneia Faustina, so he could at least claim to be married to the descendant of a famous emperor. Elagabalus also started showering large amounts of money on the army, but this was no longer enough to guarantee their loyalty, especially now that they had an alternate emperor. Either out of his own paranoia or at the prompting of his mother Julia Soaemius or both, Elagabalus tried to assassinate his heir not once but several times. This proved too much for the army, who started a revolt. Elagabalus appeared at an army camp with Severus Alexander to try to calm them, only to find that his own grandmother had turned on him and was encouraging the soldiers to install Severus Alexander as the new emperor. When Elagabalus tried to have the leading troops arrested, the entire garrison turned on him. The emperor, his mother, and many of their courtiers, including Heracles, were stabbed to death, and Severus Alexander was proclaimed emperor, with Julia Mesa, who did not hesitate to sacrifice her own daughter and grandson, still at the helm until her death shortly afterward. Unfortunately, the reality that the army, which had become larger and better funded than ever before under the Severans, could just make or break emperors at any time, could no longer be denied. Even after a successful 13-year reign, the army would still turn on Severus Alexander and kill him, inaugurating the crisis of the 3rd century, where emperors rapidly came and went for nearly 50 years. So the last question is, how many of the stories about Elagabalus were true? The boring but honest answer is we really can't say, but there are clues here and there. It's possible his marriage to a Vestal virgin was just a version of a sacred marriage between two humans representing a god and goddess, a rite found in different cultures around the Mediterranean. Most of the stories about him trying to make Elagabal the chief god of Rome are probably bunk, not least because Dio Cassius and the Historia Augusta constantly switch between saying Elagabalus wanted to abolish all other sects and claiming that he tried to adopt their practices. There's also ridiculous stories about the anecdote of him sacrificing children, especially the children of Italian aristocrats, of course, to his god, which sound a lot like what Romans said about nearly every other religion they didn't like, including Christianity. But there might have been a grain of truth, since after 220 we start seeing coins dedicated not to Jupiter, the Roman king of the gods, but to Elagabalus. As for Elagabalus's gender and sexuality, given how close those sources were to Elagabalus's own lifetime, both Cassius and Herodian lived through his reign, it could be significant that all the sources do name Elagabalus's male lover, Heracles. In fact, while no mention of a charioteer named Heracles has ever been found outside accounts of Elagabalus's reign, there is a record of an Aurelius Zodicus at the court of Severus Alexander, Elagabalus's successor. It's not definite proof, but it is suggestive. But I do question Cassius's claim that Elagabalus wanted to become a woman, as intriguing as a trans emperor would be. The fact that Cassius also mockingly mentions the fact that Elagabalus was circumcised, which was common among most Semitic peoples. I suspect that in the minds of critics like Cassius, his circumcision and his notorious effeminacy combined to give rise to the idea that he must have wanted to physically become a woman. Elagabalus was not successful as a Roman emperor by most standards, I think. It's safe to say. He left behind no major reforms, won no wars, although at least he didn't start any, and his religious reforms, especially if they were as extensive as the historians make it sound, didn't outlast him at all. In fact, one of Julia Mace's first acts was to send the sacred stone of Elagabalus back to Edessa. But like his fellow decadent Roman emperors, Caligula and Nero, he left behind a fascination that has made him more famous than some of the emperors the Romans would have considered great. Elagabalus was celebrated by the decadent movement of the late 19th century. Over time, his life became the subject of several operas, novels, plays, rock songs, a short comic by Neil Gaiman, and so on. Sadly, to my knowledge, there isn't a concept album about him, although I suspect you could arrange a bunch of songs by someone like David Bowie in a playlist and pretend. If half the stories about him are at all true, I suspect he would have been happy with that outcome.